Hello and welcome to another session on women's writing in English. Let's continue with the garden party. So we have Mr. Sheridan finding out Mr. Sheridan having gotten to know this of Scott's death from another source, and he and Mrs. Sheridan they are all sitting under the marquee and they're talking. Suddenly she looked up. There on the table were all those sandwiches, cakes, puffs, all uneaten, all going to be wasted. She had one of her brilliant ideas. "I know," she said. "Let's make up a basket. Let's send that poor creature some of this perfectly good food. At any rate, it will be the greatest treat for the children. Don't you agree? And she is sure to have neighbors calling in and so on. What a point to have it already prepared, Laura." "Laura," she jumped up, get me the big basket out of the stairs cupboard." "But mother, do you really think it's a good idea?" said Laura. Again, how curious she seemed to be different from them all. To take scribes from their party. Would the poor woman really like that? "Of course. What's the matter with you today? An hour or two ago you were insisting on us being sympathetic, and now..." Laura ran for the breakfast. It was filled, it was heaved by her mother. "Take it to yourself, darling," said she. Run down as you are." "No, wait. Take the arum lilies too. People of that class are so impressed by arum lilies. The stem will ruin her lace frocks," said practical Joyce. So they would, just in time. Only the basket then. And Laura, her mother, followed her out of the marquee. "Don't on any account." "What, mother?" "No, better not put such ideas into the child's head. Nothing. Run along." It was just growing dusky as Laura shut their garden gates. A big dog ran by like a shadow. The road gleamed white, and down below in the hollow the little cottages were in deep shade. How quiet it seemed after the afternoon. Here she was going down the hill to somewhere where a man lay dead, and she wouldn't realize it. Why couldn't she? She stopped a minute, and it seemed to her that kisses, voices, tinkling spoons, laughter, the smell of crushed grass were somehow inside her. She had no room for anything else. How strange! She looked up at the pale sky, and all she thought was, yes, it was the most successful. Now the broad road was crossed. The lane began, smoky and dark. Women in shawls and men's tweed caps hurried by. Men hung over the palings. The children played in the doorways. A low hum from the mean little cottages. In some of them there was a flicker of light, and a shadow, crab-like, moved across the window. Laura bent her head and hurried on. She wished now she had put on a coat. Her frock shone, and big hat with a velvet streamer. If only it was another hat. Were the people looking at her? They must be. It was a mistake to have come. She knew all along it was a mistake. Should she go back even now? No, too late. This was the house. It must be. A dark knot of people stood outside. Beside the gate, an old woman who with a crutch sat in a chair watching. She had her feet on a newspaper. The voices stopped as Laura drew near. The group parted. It was as though she was expected, as though they had known she was coming here. Laura was terribly nervous. Tossing the violet ribbon over her shoulder, she said to a woman standing by, "Is this Mrs. Scott's house?" And the woman, smiling, queerly said, "It is, my lass." "Oh, to be away from this," she actually said. "Help me, God," as she walked up the tiny path and knocked. To be away from those staring eyes, or to be covered up in anything, one of those woman's shawls even. "I'll just leave the basket and go," she decided. "I shan't even wait for it to be emptied. Then the door opened. A little woman in black showed in the gloom. Laura said, "Are you Mrs. Scott?" But to her horror, the woman answered, "Walk in, please, miss," and she was shut in the passage. "No," said Laura, "I don't want to come in. I only want to leave this basket Mother sent." The little woman in the gloomy passage seemed not to have heard her. "Step this way, please, miss," she said in an oily voice, and Laura followed her. She found herself in a wretched little low kitchen, lighted by a smoky lamp. There was a woman sitting before the fire. Said the little creature who had let her in. It's a young lady." She turned to Laura. She said meaningly, "I'm her sister, miss. You'll excuse her, won't you?" "Oh, but of course," said Laura. Please don't disturb her. I only want to leave." But at that moment, the woman at the fire turned around, her face puffed up, red with swollen eyes and swollen lips, looked terrible. She seemed as though she couldn't understand why Laura was there. What did it mean? Why was this stranger standing in the kitchen with a basket? What was it all about? And the poor face puckered up again. "All right, my dear," said the other. "I'll thank the good young lady." And again she began, "You'll excuse her, miss, I'm sure," and her face swollen too, tried an oily smile. Laura only wanted to get away, to get away. She was back in the passage. The door opened. She walked straight through into the bedroom where the dead man was lying. "You'd look at him, wouldn't you?" said M's sister, and she brushed past Laura over to the bed. "Don't be afraid, my lass." And now her voice sounded fond and sly, and fondly she drew down the sheet. "Looks a picture. There's nothing to show. Come along, my dear." Laura came. There lay a young man, fast asleep, sleeping so soundly, so deeply that he was far, far away from them both. Oh, so remote, so peaceful. He was dreaming. Never wake him up again. His head was sunk in the pillow. His eyes were closed. They were blind under the closed eyelids. He was given up to his dream. What did garden parties and baskets and lace frocks matter to him? He was far from all those things. He was wonderful, beautiful. While they were laughing and while the band was playing, this marvel had come to the lane. Happy, happy. "All is well," said that sleeping face. "This is just as it should be. I'm content." But all the same, you had to cry, and she couldn't go out of the room without saying something to him. Laura gave a loud, childish sob. "Forgive my hat," she said. And this time she didn't wait for M's sister. She found her way out of the door, down the path, past all those dark people. At the corner of the lane, she met Laurie. He stepped out of the shadow. "Is that you, Laura?" "Yes." Mother was getting anxious. "Was it all right?" "Yes, quite." "Oh, Laurie." She took his arm. She pressed up against him. "I say, you're not crying, are you?" asked her brother. Laura shook her head. She was. Laurie put his arm round her shoulder. "Don't cry," he said in his warm, loving voice. "Was it awful?" "No," sobbed Laura. "It was simply marvelous." "But Laurie," she stopped. She looked at her brother. "Isn't life," she stammered, "isn't life, but what life was she couldn't explain. No matter, he quite understood. Isn't it, darling?" said Laura. So that's it. We have come to the end of the garden party, and let's do a critical analysis quickly. Okay, so we have Laura, Mrs. Sheridan, up with a very good plan for saving her the leftovers. She has decided to give it to the Scott's family. Now, so you can see how unsympathetic this woman is. So unsympathetic that she only thinks about herself, not wasting the food. She just wants to give it away, and she feels that they would be happy. She doesn't think about what the situation, right? And she also even asks the lilies to be given to the family. So she says people of that class are so impressed by arum lilies, but then takes them back when Joe says, oh, that's going to spoil, when if Laura's going to carry that, it's going to spoil her clothes. Mrs. Sheridan also wanted to give her an advice. She goes on to say, for heaven's sake, don't on any account, that's it. And she stops. She declines to finish her sentence, deciding instead not to put such ideas into a child's head. So anyway, whatever went into her head, or whatever she wanted to say to Laura, would have been to do with the Scott's family. Don't touch anything, don't eat anything, don't stand there for long, and so on, because she considered pathetic. So again, there is no sympathy in her voice, no feeling in her voice for the dead man. Mrs. Sheridan only has her idea when her husband mentions the accident, which suggests that she may take his input seriously. However, Mrs. Sheridan continues to appear incapable of truly expressing sympathy for the pain of others, and her agreement that she should not risk damaging Laura's frock by sending the flowers, after all, shows that Mrs. Sheridan or the Sheridans continue to prioritize their outward appearance above everything else. Laura again disagrees with her mother's judgment, but nevertheless cannot translate that disagreement into action. Instead, she dutifully does what her mother asks. So Laura feels, that is the reason why she says, Laura feels it is not a right idea or a good idea to take these things, leftovers, to these people, to the grieving family, especially after when in a mourning or in to a funeral house. She feels that it is wrong, and Mrs. Sheridan suddenly says, a minute or two ago you were accusing us of not being sympathetic. So this is the idea of sympathy that Mrs. Sheridan has for others, which cannot even be called sympathy at all. Mrs. Sheridan, so she gives importance only to the outward appearance, and Laura tries to disagree to her mother's judgment, but she cannot. She dutifully does what her mother asks her to do. And also, if you look at the last sentence, which Mrs. Sheridan did not finish, she expresses her expectation. Laura, she knew or she understood that Laura will disobey it, even though it's being told. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it would be she doesn't want to put such things into the child's head. Okay. Anyway, it can be taken in both negative as well as positive sense. Because if you are Laura she knew Laura was different from that of her other children. She is a sensitive soul, and if she's asked to do a particular thing, or maybe it was not to stand there for a long time, not to get inside the house or so, but she knew that Laura would disobey her, and that could be one reason why she stopped. Okay. And then Laura leaves the garden. She goes down to the house. She enters the house, and the moment she enters the house, she becomes very conscious of what the dress that she has worn. It's a party frock. She also has a hat, and the way she came to a funeral, she feels that she shouldn't have come at all. She feels uncomfortable in the lower class neighborhood. That's another thing. Once she arrives, she is intensely uncomfortable in the lower class neighborhood. Even though she intellectually understands that that class is a socially constructed one, it is arbitrary or a social construct, she cannot, or she feels disgusted. Okay? It's not the same kind of disgust that Mrs. Sheridan has, but a kind of suffocation. Those earlier realizations happened inside Sheridan's home's gate among the cottages. For the first time, Laura realizes the social differences are based in concrete economic inequalities that she cannot surmount with her imagination alone. So there is a harsh difference, or there is a difference between reality and one's imagination. She, for the first time, feels odd. She feels like she stands out and learns what it is like to be treated, or she feels suffocated. She just wants to leave the place. Suddenly the door opens and the woman tells Laura to come in against her protests, and she gets in. She looks at she reaches the room where the wife of Mrs. Scott, Mr. Scott, Mrs. Scott is, and it is here that she gets a harsh understanding of the reality around her. Although Laura comes to express her family's condolences, her inability to finish a sentence ends up inverting the expected social obligation. The Scott family ends up comforting the crying Laura. She has come to comfort or she has come to express her family's condolence, but it's the other way around. And Catherine Mansfield let us or tell us whether she leaves, or does not tell us whether she leaves the basket after all. Even here the poor end up serving the rich, as M's sister leads Laura around the house and shows her Scott's body when she seems to want to see it. Laura's preoccupations with her own guilt prevents her from feeling or expressing empathy for the mourning M. And not just that, Laura is overcome with a sense of tranquility. Is that the theme of death, eternal life. She feels that he's sleeping, and that sleep is beautiful. Laura's anxiety gives look over the Scott's corpse. She feels that he's dreaming. Her earlier sense of outrage at Scott's death has disappeared and plays no part in her reaction to the body. Her confrontation with death, like Joseph, the earlier song that we heard or we saw read in the short in this story, her confrontation with death makes her class consciousness, or fades her class consciousness. Even her obsession with her own hat suggests that she is too afraid of judgment to sincerely give her condolences. And when she looks at him, the death, which is a sudden leveler, what garden party matters to her, what hat matters to him. He is sleeping an eternal, blissful sleep, a coveted sleep, in fact. So Laura, she looks at him, she cries, and she rushes out, walks past the rest of the cottages, and she encounters Laurie on the road, who has come looking for her because he was worried. The story ends with Laurie's reply, "Isn't it, darling?" So Laura and Laurie meet on the end that separates the rich from the poor. Laurie's assumption that Laura must have been horrified by what she has seen reflects the Sheridan's party line, concern for the family members who have been exposed to poverty rather than for people suffering it. The narrator pretends that Laurie quite understood, even though he clearly does not, which reflects Laura's increasing distance from her family, as well as the Sheridans' tendency to insist that they know best even when they are incompetent. Ultimately, however, Catherine Mansfield does not say precisely what Laura has realized. Perhaps in an attempt to let the reader's response determine the story's meaning. Let us readers understand. You have already studied reader's response theory. Much as Laura's response to Scott's body determines its meaning for her, it is clear that Laura has learned something about class, about life, and about death on the day of the garden party. However, at the end of the story, she is caught between her family's world of superficial images and the world of authentic suffering that the Scotts represent, and she is unable to fully communicate with either side. But nevertheless, she is in both the sides. She fits into both sides as well. She tries to take a glimpse of both sides as well. So with that, we come to the end of the garden party. Okay, so that's it. Thank you and keep safe.